The hunger was not a sharp, immediate pain, but a deep, aching emptiness in Elara Vance's middle. It was a hollow sound, a rumbling stomach that mirrored the vast, echoing space where her emergency fund should have been. Her rent was due on Friday. Her child needed new shoes. 2 part-time jobs, one slinging coffee, the other stocking shelves in a discount grocery, were a treadmill of exhaustion that kept her standing still. At 32, a single mother living above a relentlessly loud laundromat, Elara felt less like a person and more like a collection of perpetually late bills. Her skills, a razor-sharp, almost photographic memory, and the rigorous forensic research abilities honed and abandoned during her college debate years, were useless here, traded for the thin promise of a paycheck. She was the every woman, the underdog, seeking only a sliver of breathing room. This desperate search had led her 60 miles out of the city to a rural estate sale where everything smelled of mildew and endings. The house itself, a grand, forgotten Victorian, was a mausoleum of lost memories, crowded with the detritus of a life she couldn't afford to imagine. She was hunting for one thing: a profitable flip, an antique lamp, a vintage tool set, anything to turn $20 into $50. She moved past the expensive, heavy furniture that was far beyond her budget and her truck's hauling capacity, pressing herself into the damp, forgotten corners of the cluttered basement. And then she saw it. Tucked beneath the sagging velvet of an ottoman that looked like it had been forgotten since the Great War, was a heavy, oblong wooden box. It was caked in the dust of decades, its surface rough beneath her fingertips, but the carvings were intricate, almost hypnotic, a dense weave of knotwork that seemed to tell an unknown story. The wood was dark, heavy, and silent. It had no lock, but it was sealed shut with its own weight and time. The owner, a thin, tired man with a perpetually weary sigh, wasn't interested in haggling over basement junk. Elara, leveraging her need with a cool, simple honesty, spoke a single number. He sighed again, a sound of absolute surrender, and accepted the $20. The transaction was over in a breath, and she lugged the surprisingly weighty box to her truck, the antique wood cool against her aching chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was a bruised orange smear sinking behind the skyline when she finally returned to her small, cramped apartment, the noisy vibrations of the washers below a constant, irritating thrum. The box sat on her kitchen table, now the center of her universe, displacing the pile of unpaid bills. She used a kitchen knife to gently pry the heavy lid. It didn't open with a dramatic creak, but a quiet, almost reluctant sigh. Inside was not the expected junk, no coins, no broken tools, no old photographs. Instead, nestled on a layer of faded purple silk, were just 2 objects. The first was a single, brittle, handwritten letter. The paper was fine but yellowed, folded twice, and sealed with a dollop of curious, dark red wax that bore no emblem, no stamp, and no recognizable mark. The paper crackled like dry leaves beneath her touch. She ignored the seal and unfolded it, her eyes seeking the signature, the date, the answer. It was dated 1923. The sender was anonymous. The second object was a tarnished, heavy silver key. It was old, intricate, and unique, far too large and complex for a simple lockbox. The key had a specific weight and coldness to it, a feeling of forgotten purpose. Elara's eyes settled on the letter's text, her heart beating a little faster now, the exhaustion receding, replaced by a sudden electric focus that only a true mystery could spark. There was no flowing prose, no long explanation, no family greeting. Only one cryptic line, penned in an elegant but urgent script. The weight of the truth rests in the cold heart of the mountain, safe from the man with the golden touch. The sentence hit her with the force of an actual blow. It was a single, shocking phrase that immediately raised a massive, terrifying "what if?" question. What truth? Which mountain? Who was the man with the golden touch? This wasn't a family keepsake. It was a warning. It was a fragment of a secret, a piece of a legacy that suddenly felt less like a lucky find and more like an implied danger. The silver key lay heavy in her palm, a palpable threat, a promise of a burden far greater than the $20 she had paid. Her life, the life of endless bills and late-night shifts, had just intersected with a secret history, and the protagonist, the seeker, was now in possession of the only key. The rumbling in her stomach was gone, replaced by the frantic, insistent pulse of the chase. The air in Elara's apartment, usually stale and close, seemed to hum with a sudden, tense energy, the $20 box now a potent anchor. The mystery, however foolish or impractical, had already performed a small miracle. It had quieted the relentless churn of her anxieties. The bills were still there, stacked beneath a coffee stain, but now they felt distant, overshadowed by the brittle promise of a secret almost a century old. The call to action had been delivered, the audience engaged, and now the camera, the invisible eye, had to swing back to the woman who held the key. Who was this seeker, and why did she, of all people, now clutch the fragile fate of a historical wrong? Elara Vance was a master of self-sabotage, a scholar of the near miss. Her 20s had been a blur of high hopes and low returns. She had been the star of her university's debate team, a student of history with a rare and formidable gift, a nearly photographic memory. She could call up the full text of a document, the specific shade of ink on an old map, or the convoluted financial details of a stock market crash from 1929 with startling accuracy. Her dream was to be a history professor, to excavate the truth, to reveal the hidden architecture of the past. But she fell in love with a man whose promise proved as hollow as her current bank account. The marriage was a spectacular, quiet failure, dissolving into a mountain of consumer debt and a child support order that was rarely, if ever, fulfilled. She left academia with a half-finished thesis and a stack of rejection letters, the intellectual pursuit traded for survival. Now she was an everyman, crushed beneath the weight of modern living, the ghost of the scholar she could have been haunting her late-night shifts. The debt was a constant, icy weight, a current that threatened to drag her under completely. This desperation, this fear of losing the roof over her daughter's head, was the only reason she had been standing in that mildewed basement, searching for quick cash to flip. The need was primal, the stakes immediate. And yet, the moment her fingers traced the curious unmarked wax crest on the old letter, the dormant instinct awakened. The scent of the old paper was like an intoxicating drug, pulling at her mind like a powerful, inescapable tide. It was an unnecessary distraction, a foolish, time-consuming detour from the grueling reality of her 2 low-wage jobs, yet she could not walk away. The scholar in her, the seeker, demanded to know the meaning of that single, cryptic line. The weight of the truth rests in the cold heart of the mountain, safe from the man with the golden touch. Ignoring the urgent pleas of her own exhaustion, she pushed the dishes aside and opened her laptop. Her face, framed by the cold blue light of the screen, was thin, drawn, the hollow-eyed look of someone who had survived on 4 hours of sleep for a month. The clock was nearing midnight. She was risking 2 hours of precious restorative sleep, but the pull of the mystery was stronger than the call of her aching bones. She started simply, forensically, with the only 2 pieces of concrete data she possessed. First, the date, 1923, a time of precarious economic boom between 2 great collapses. Second, the single line of text. She cross-referenced the phrase, "man with the golden touch," with historical figures in the region during that era, searching for financial titans, mining barons, or industrialists known for Midas-like wealth. thousands of results flashed by, a confusing parade of long-dead names. Next, she tried to identify the wax crest, zooming in with the camera on her phone to capture every minute detail. It was nothing she could find in any database of known family seals, corporate logos, or Masonic markings. It was stubbornly, perfectly blank. The key, too, was a dead end, intricate and unique, but untraceable. Every research avenue she pursued, every line of inquiry she chased, led only to a blank wall. The conspiracy, or whatever this fragment of history represented, was buried deep, meticulously erased. The frustration was a familiar, bitter taste, but it didn't stop her. The photographic memory, her latent skill, began to catalog the failures. She was already building a mental map of what the secret wasn't, a process of elimination that would eventually guide her to the truth. She glanced at the silver key lying on the faded silk. It was heavy, tangible proof that the truth it spoke of was real, locked away somewhere. Elara had always sought the academic truth. Now she was chasing a physical one, and the foolish $20 quest had just risked her few hours of sleep, confirming that the seeker, the researcher, had finally clawed her way back to the surface. She was in deep, and her first failure was simply proof that the truth she sought was deliberately hidden. The game was on. The hours vanished, swallowed by the cold glow of the laptop screen and the dense architecture of historical data. The laundromat below her apartment never rested, a tireless machine that provided the soundtrack to her obsessive work. Elara, running on coffee and a primal rising sense of purpose, abandoned the search for the crest and the key's provenance. She had been attacking the problem like a novice, searching for the obvious markers of a secret society or a simple inheritance. The scholarly instinct, the relentless research drive that was her true latent skill, finally kicked in. She had to attack the source material itself. She focused an intense, almost maniacal attention on the brittle paper of the letter. The specific weave, the faint texture, the almost invisible impression of a mark pressed into the fibers, the watermark. She carefully photographed a small corner of the paper, adjusted the contrast 100 different ways, and finally saw it. A ghost image of two entwined capital letters beneath a stylized, barely discernible turret. Using a database of obscure paper mills and regional business stamps, a resource she hadn't touched since her university days, she traced the specific paper stock back to a single source, a stationery supply house that only serviced corporate accounts in the state capital between 1900 and 1930. And then the link snapped into place. The two letters, the faint turret, it was the logo of the First Commerce Trust. The name hung in the cramped, silent air of her apartment like a thunderhead. The First Commerce Trust. Established in 1902, it had been a monument to regional ambition, a symbol of aggressive frontier capitalism. Its founder, Elias Thorne, was a towering, almost mythological figure in local history. He was the quintessential industrialist, a powerful, ruthless man who controlled everything from railroads to grain silos. He was known for his relentless pursuit of hard assets, especially gold investments, and his near monopoly on regional banking. He was the archetype of unstoppable wealth and acquisition. He was, Elara realized with a sudden, chilling certainty, the man with the golden touch. The connection struck her with a force that momentarily stole her breath. This wasn't a clue, it was a detonation. The First Commerce Trust had collapsed spectacularly and mysteriously in the chaos following the stock market crash, its failure dragging down entire towns and wiping out the savings of thousands of hardworking families. It was a local tragedy that became a national footnote, the kind of crushing institutional betrayal that fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The personal stakes, until now a distant rumbling, became acutely, painfully clear. Elara's own family history was scarred by this exact collapse. Her great-grandfather, a hardscrabble farmer who had mortgaged everything to modernize his small operation, had entrusted his life savings to Thorne's bank. He lost it all. He lost the farm. He lost his future. He was left with nothing but bitterness and the consumption that took him 2 years later. The injustice was not academic. It was in her blood, an unseen legacy of poverty and dashed potential. The letter was not about treasure. It was about the original sin, the historical injustice buried beneath the First Commerce Trust's spectacular failure. She was holding a physical piece of the true secret history. Elias Thorne hadn't merely failed. He had stolen. Driven by a sudden electric adrenaline, Elara swept the two objects off the table, looking closer at the heavy, dust-caked box. Her fingers traced the knotwork carvings again, running along the seam of the bottom. It wasn't flat. There was a slight, almost imperceptible give. Using the blade of the same knife she had used to pry open the lid, she teased open a razor-thin seam in the bottom panel. The box had a false bottom. Inside the shallow space, beneath another layer of faded silk, was not a fortune in gold, but something infinitely more valuable, an old, brittle newspaper clipping. It was yellowed and fragile, an artifact of a long-dead daily paper. The headline, printed in heavy black ink, detailed a complicated, massive land deal executed by Elias Thorne in the early 1920s, involving a disputed mining claim and the aggressive acquisition of several thousand acres of wilderness. The location was starkly clear, the Blackwood Mountain Range. The cryptic sentence in the letter now made terrible, perfect sense. The cold heart of the mountain was the specific place Thorne had acquired. The weight of the truth was buried there. The man with the golden touch had not just stolen cash, he had stolen the land, the promise, and the future of an entire region. Elara Vance, the under-pressure single mother, was gone. In her place stood the seeker, the researcher whose focus was absolute. She was no longer trying to earn a fast $20, she was preparing to reclaim a forgotten legacy. She had found the first thread, and it was tied directly to the heart of a powerful historical betrayal. The game had just become deadly serious. The historical betrayal, so meticulously documented in the brittle newspaper clipping, was no longer merely the crime of a long-dead industrialist. Elara's trained eye, the eye of a research scholar, immediately sought the contemporary thread. History rarely stays buried. It merely changes hands. The man with the golden touch might be dead, but his legacy, she knew, was alive and well, controlling the architecture of the present. Her immediate research target was clear: the descendants of Elias Thorne. It did not take long for her to find him. Senator Thomas Thorne, the great-grandson, was a name synonymous with regional power, a politician whose influence stretched across the state. He was wealthy, handsome, and impeccably polished, the embodiment of institutional power, a perfect, sophisticated camouflage for the sins of the past. The family still owned vast protected tracts of the Blackwood Mountain area, the very land where the old mining claim lay. This, Elara understood, was the core of the continuing secret. Using her forgotten but potent research skills, she dove into public records, development applications, and local zoning board minutes. It was a dense, frustrating effort, but her photographic memory allowed her to hold hundreds of disparate facts in her mind, comparing map coordinates and property lines with ruthless efficiency. And then she found it: a preliminary proposal for a multi-million-dollar luxury ski resort, a massive commercial undertaking planned for the exact disputed area of the Blackwood Mountain Range detailed in the 1923 newspaper clipping. The secret, she realized, had to be physical. It was not just a historical scandal or a financial slight. It was something tangible, something still in the land, something the Thorne family needed to keep hidden before construction began, before the bulldozers broke ground and revealed the truth to the world. The weight of the truth was literally and physically tied to the cold heart of the mountain. The $20 box had not delivered a treasure, it had delivered a ticking clock. A surge of righteous anger, fueled by the memory of her own family's ruin, pushed her to action. She decided to alert the local historical society, an established and presumably neutral body. She dialed the number, her voice tight with adrenaline, beginning to explain the discovery of the old ledgers and the specific, crucial land claim. Halfway through her explanation, as she named the ancestor and the bank, the line went abruptly, jarringly dead. Not disconnected, but cut. A sudden, deep silence replaced the static. She tried redialing, but the line simply clicked, cold and unresponsive. The academic pursuit was over. This was a direct counter-move. She was suddenly, intensely aware of the sounds of the city below, the pounding of the washing machines, the distant wail of a siren, the casual, rhythmic noise of a life she barely managed to hold together. But that night, the noise shifted. As she stood by her tiny, grimy window, looking out onto the street, she saw it. Parked down the block, where the streetlights dimmed into shadow, was a dark, unmarked sedan. Its presence was a silent, cold violation. The windows were tinted to an absolute darkness that only existed far from city lights, a visual cue of external, well-resourced power. It sat low on its springs, utterly still, utterly menacing. The prickle of observation ran like ice water down her back. It was not a historical puzzle anymore. It was a present danger. Her simple, desperate pursuit of quick cash had put her under the gaze of a powerful institutional family, capable of silencing phone calls and deploying silent surveillance. The family of Senator Thomas Thorne, the political scion built upon the stolen foundations of his great-grandfather. She backed away from the window, the old key suddenly heavy in her hand. She opened her palm and stared at the tarnished metal. It was so cold, so heavy, and it seemed to burn a faint imprint onto her skin, a physical reminder of the heat now directed at her. Elara Vance, the everywoman, was now an unwitting custodian of a massive, dangerous secret, pursued by the shadow of the golden touch. She knew with chilling certainty that the only thing separating her from the institutional shadow was the anonymity of her poverty and the fact that they did not yet know what she possessed. But the sedan was proof that they knew someone was digging. The time for digital research was over. She had to go to the mountain. The decision was a cold, sharp thing, stripped of any emotion but necessity. The dark sedan, the silenced phone line, these were not just coincidences. They were the institutional shadow reaching out. Elara knew that the moment she tried to publish her findings digitally, she would be crushed, the evidence buried, and her life ruined by legal or extra-legal means. The evidence had to be retrieved physically. The $40 profit she had originally chased was now irrelevant. This had become a question of moral conviction, a chance to right a century-old wrong that had directly impacted her own legacy. She took her meager savings, the cash she had set aside for the overdue electricity bill, and purchased a cheap train ticket. It was the longest, slowest route to the nearest town near the Blackwood Mountain Range. As the city retreated, replaced by endless fields and then the foreboding rise of the peaks, the air of danger became thicker, exchanging the claustrophobic dread of her apartment for the vast exposed threat of the wilderness. The town she arrived in felt like a ghost of the one Elias Thorne had ruined. Its buildings sagged like an old man's shoulders, the windows of the former bustling Main Street, dark and dusty. It was a tangible testament to the wealth that had been sucked out, leaving only a husk after the First Commerce Trust collapsed in the 1930s. The poverty here was not the frantic, wired poverty of the city, but a deep, settled resignation. Elara knew the cold heart of the mountain was not just a metaphor. Using the coordinates from the old newspaper clipping and her ingrained knowledge of regional history, she pinpointed the likely location. High on the disputed mining claim sat the abandoned Thorne family hunting lodge, an isolated stone structure built during the peak of Elias Thorne's power. It was the only building remotely grand enough, isolated enough, to house the weight of the truth. She checked her phone. The battery life was dangerously low. In a desperate final effort, she found a dim, dusty corner in the bus depot, connected to the sluggish public Wi-Fi, and used her remaining juice to download the regional surveyor maps and geological data she had flagged during her research. These detailed topographic lines, once merely academic interest, were now her only chance of survival. She knew the general route, but these maps would show her the forgotten trails, the old logging cuts, the paths that vehicles couldn't follow. The hike began at dawn. The Blackwood mountain range was forbidding, vast and silent. The air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth, but the beauty was undercut by a raw, ancient sense of danger. Elara, physically soft from years of sedentary low-wage work, quickly found her pace labored. She focused on the rhythm of her feet, conserving her energy. Her mind locked onto the image of her great-grandfather's ruined life. This mental clarity made her lean and weathered, like an old fence post almost instantly, driven by the sheer will to survive the journey and reach the objective. She followed a barely discernible access road, overgrown with brambles and loose rock. The only sounds were her own heavy breathing and the rustle of leaves. Then the silence was abruptly, violently punctuated. The sound was a distant guttural rumble, the heavy-treaded engine of an off-road vehicle approaching rapidly. Elara dove off the road without hesitation, scrambling behind a thick curtain of mountain laurel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed herself into the damp earth, clutching the silver key in her pocket. The vehicle appeared moments later, a dark, mud-splattered 4x4 with heavily reinforced tires. Inside were two men. They were not hikers or loggers. They were lean, weathered individuals whose faces were set in expressions of cold, professional intensity. They wore no company uniform, but their bearing suggested disciplined aggression. They carried rifles slung over their chests, weapons far more substantial than was necessary for casual hunting. This is a manhunt, and she is the quarry. They drove slowly, systematically, scanning the tree line, their eyes sharp and practiced. One man was holding a radio, speaking in quick, simple monosyllables that Elara couldn't decipher. They were looking for something specific, and that something, she knew, was her. She waited in the dirt until the sound of the engine faded into the distant canyons. The danger was no longer implied. It was tangible, breathing, and armed. Senator Thorne's institutional shadow had been deployed. Elara Vance, the underdog, was now utterly alone in the wilderness, running from the powerful legacy of the Golden Touch. Logic dictated she should turn back, but moral conviction, the weight of her family's stolen history, demanded she use the silver key. The mystery had claimed her. The climb was an act of raw, desperate will. Elara moved with the single-minded focus of an animal fleeing a hunter, relying on the surveyor maps etched into her memory and the adrenaline of mortal fear. By midday, she reached the high plateau, utterly exhausted, her body feeling as thin and brittle as the parchment in her pocket. She had become, in the unforgiving ascent, as lean and weathered as an old fence post herself. The Thorne family hunting lodge stood exactly where the maps predicted, a brutalist fortress of rough-hewn granite, a monument to past arrogance. It was built not for comfort, but to withstand a siege, staring out over the vast tracts of stolen land that had made the Thorne name powerful. She approached the structure cautiously, using the shadows of the surrounding pines for cover, confirming that the patrol vehicles she'd heard earlier were nowhere in sight. The windows were dark, and the heavy oak door was secured with a massive ornamental lock. She ignored the obvious entry point. The truth was never found in the grand foyer. It was in the corners, the forgotten spaces. She worked her way around the perimeter, her fingers tracing the cold stone, until she found a small, low window leading into the cellar. It was unlatched, covered only by a fine, dusty layer of cobwebs. She slipped inside. The cellar was cold, dry, and surprisingly orderly. It was a perfect temperature for aging wine and keeping secrets. Musty bottles lined shelves that stretched from the dirt floor to the low ceiling. Her heart hammered, her breath catching in her throat as she swept her gaze across the rough stone walls. She was searching for a break, a seam, anything that betrayed the deception. And then she saw it. Behind a heavy, freestanding wine rack, one that could be rolled aside, was a break in the smooth expanse of granite. It was a small, nearly invisible cast-iron door, set flush into the rock, designed to look like a maintenance hatch or a ventilation cover. It had no handle, only a thick, complex keyhole. Elara pulled the tarnished silver key from her pocket. It was cold and heavy, a relic waiting for its purpose. Her hand was trembling, but her mind was laser-focused. The key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for her touch for 100 years, turning with a smooth, decisive click that echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the vault. She pulled the iron door open. It led into a cramped, dry, utterly silent hidden chamber. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry, no literal treasure. There was only the truth. Stacked neatly on simple wooden shelves, preserved from the damp and the light of nearly a century, were dozens of ledgers, bound in heavy crimson leather. They were meticulously organized, labeled in the same elegant, urgent script as the initial letter. Elara pulled the first volume and opened it to a random page. The photographic memory she possessed, the latent skill that had languished in her 2 dead-end jobs, became her greatest weapon. She didn't have to study the pages, she consumed them. The red ledgers contained the true, secret history of the First Commerce Trust. They were not bank records, they were a systematic, comprehensive accounting of Elias Thorne's betrayal. They revealed that the collapse of the bank in the 1930s was not due to financial instability, but to a vast premeditated embezzlement. Thorne had systematically siphoned liquid capital from his own institution, creating a deep reserve of stolen funds. He then used this black capital to aggressively buy up the very assets, the homes, the farms, the businesses, of his ruined clients at criminally low prices, turning their misery into his absolute dominion. He was not a victim of the crash. He was its architect, but the final terrifying piece of the conspiracy was the motive. A later ledger detailed the purchase of the Blackwood Mountain mining claim, the cold heart of the mountain. Tucked inside its pages was a geological survey dated shortly before the bank's collapse. It revealed a massive, unrecorded quartz deposit laced with high-grade metal ore, a hidden mineral wealth that would make the Thorne family exponentially rich. Elias Thorne had stolen the life savings of his clients to acquire land that he knew held a fortune, then orchestrated the bank's failure to cover the theft and ensure no one had the resources to challenge his land grab. This was the ultimate betrayal. He had financially murdered his community to create his own kingdom. Elara's own great-grandfather's name was there, staring up from the ledger, his life savings reduced to a single, devastating line item. The $20 box had not brought her fortune. It had brought her a century of hidden, documented injustice. She now stood in the meticulously organized core of a high-stakes conspiracy, holding the key to the ruin of the current Thorne dynasty. The weight of the truth was immense, and she had mere hours to transfer it from paper to digital proof before the men with the rifles arrived. The hours vanished, swallowed by the cold glow of the laptop screen and the dense architecture of historical data. Elara Vance did not sleep. The cramped hidden chamber, dry and silent, became her war room. She had brought with her a small, cheapish digital camera, a forgotten relic she'd intended to sell for $10, and it was now the most important piece of technology in her life. She worked through the night, powered by a cold, searing energy of righteous anger. The scale of Elias Thorne's treachery was staggering. Page after page of the red ledgers detailed a calculated, multi-year conspiracy that went far beyond mere greed. It was a complete institutional takeover, financed by the systematic ruin of his neighbors. She meticulously photographed every single sheet, capturing the names of the families destroyed, the precise dates of their foreclosures, and the shamefully small amounts Thorne paid for their land and livelihood. The process was slow, painstaking, and absolutely essential. Every flash of the camera was a blow struck against a century of lies. The sheer, documented evil of the plot stripped away every layer of Elara's fear and self-doubt. She looked at the figures, seeing not numbers, but lives, the life her great-grandfather could have led, the generational wealth that was stolen from her own line. The struggling single mother, the underdog, was gone. In her place stood the seeker of justice, her photographic memory now focused on a moral target. The evidence was the inheritance that truly mattered. She found her own great-grandfather's name scrawled in a dense, spidery hand, a single devastating line item detailing the transaction that robbed him of his farm and ultimately his life. Seeing the documentation confirmed the family legend, validating the bitterness that had lingered for 3 generations. This was not a theoretical crusade, it was a deeply personal act of redemption. As the first faint hint of pre-dawn light filtered through the small ventilation slits of the lodge above, bringing with it the crisp, clean smell of pine, Elara finished the last page. She reviewed the image count. Over 2,000 high-resolution photographs, the truth digitized and safely contained within a memory card the size of her thumbnail. She secured the camera and the silver key, tucking both into an inner zipped pocket of her worn jacket. The quiet, desperate triumph was short-lived. The silence of the mountain was suddenly, violently broken, not by the distant rumble of a truck, but by the insistent, pulsing thrum of rotor blades. A helicopter was approaching, its massive sound wave washing over the lodge. Senator Thorne's men had found her. The institutional shadow was no longer stationary on her city street. It was airborne and directly overhead. A desperate, primal scramble ensued. She carefully closed the iron door, replaced the dusty wine rack, and exited the way she had entered, through the small cellar window. She flattened herself against the cold granite wall of the lodge, just as a heavy, reinforced door on the front side of the building burst inward with a sickening crack of splintering wood. The hired men, the lean, weathered individuals from the day before, stormed the main lodge. She heard their heavy boots on the wood floor above her head, the sharp, terse sound of their voices echoing in the grand, empty space. "Check the basement. She can't be far." Elara slipped away from the lodge, using the thick early morning mist and the shadow of the outbuildings for cover. She was clutching the camera like a precious stone, the hard plastic reassuring against her side. She heard the inevitable discovery, a muffled shout from the basement, followed by a curse. They had found the empty chamber. They realized instantly that she knew. She ran blindly down a steep, rocky decline, driven purely by the fear that she would be caught and the evidence destroyed. She was utterly alone and exposed on the side of a massive, unforgiving mountain, pursued by the well-resourced agents of the modern-day Golden Touch. The dramatic irony was immense, the tension unbearable. Elara Vance, the woman who risked a $20 investment to make rent, now held the digital proof that would shatter the political and financial dynasty of Senator Thomas Thorne. She possessed the means to ruin him, but she had mere minutes to escape the mountain before the search expanded, before the helicopter could spot her in the dense tree line, and before the ultimate vindication was crushed under the weight of institutional power. The climax was upon her, demanding survival above all else. The roar of the departing helicopter was a cruel soundtrack to Elara's desperate flight. She made a perilous descent, abandoning the winding access road the security patrols were using. She was deep in the Blackwood Mountain wilderness, where a misplaced step could mean a broken ankle and certain capture. The surveyor maps she had downloaded, her photographic memory calling up the dense tangle of lines and coordinates, became her lifeline. She located an old, almost completely overgrown logging trail, a path too steep, too narrow, and too treacherous for the heavy off-road vehicles of the Thorn men. She scrambled down, sliding on loose shale and clinging to rock faces, the silver key and the camera bag thudding against her chest. Her fear was transmuted into pure, physical motion, her body reacting on instinct, the seeker fighting for her life and for the legacy of justice. Hours later, bruised and dehydrated, she emerged from the dense pine line near the dusty, forgotten highway. She had escaped the cold heart of the mountain. Her immediate need was not rest, but connection. The camera held the truth, but until that truth was released to a trusted high-level authority, it was just a liability. She walked the final mile into the nearest town, a ghost community still bearing the scars of the First Commerce Trust collapse. Her destination, the public library, a small, quiet sanctuary in a world that had become hostile. Inside, the silence was deafening after the chaos of the mountain. Elara moved with quick, economical steps, finding an obscure computer terminal. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, a delayed reaction to the trauma, but her resolve was absolute steel. She uploaded the 2,000 photographs of the red ledgers to the cloud, creating a final, unassailable backup. The next step was the transfer. She needed a moral anchor, someone who would recognize the severity of the institutional theft and who possessed the academic credibility to vet the evidence. She thought immediately of Professor Alistair Finch, her former college history professor, a man renowned for his uncompromising ethical standards and his deep respect for historical truth. She hadn't spoken to him in a decade, a connection severed by her failure to finish her degree and the shame of her subsequent life. But he was her only best shot. She composed the email, her fingers moving swiftly, typing a brief, urgent message to accompany the massive data transfer. The subject line was stark, direct, and undeniable. Thorn's legacy, proof of theft. She clicked send. The validation was underway. It was in that precise, fragile moment of supreme relief and vulnerability that the scene shifted and the dramatic irony reached its terrifying zenith. The heavy glass front doors of the library opened. Senator Thomas Thorn walked in. He was immaculate, perfectly composed, an apparition of tailored power. He spoke immediately to the elderly librarian at the front desk, his voice a practiced, smooth rumble of concern. He was asking about a missing family friend, a transparent lie, a thin cover for his frantic, high-level search. Elara was only 20 feet away, hidden deep within the shadowy recess of a bathroom stall, having just finished the email. Her heart lurched, seizing in her chest. She risked a small, terrifying glance through the crack in the door, seeing the antagonist in sharp, immediate relief. His face was a mask of practiced, professional benevolence, but the look in his eyes, the look she now catalogued with the camera flash of her mind, was cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. It was the same look of predatory control that must have lived in the eyes of Elias Thorn a century before. An extreme close-up on the eyes of the man with the golden touch, the institutional power closing the loop on the underdog. He was utterly unaware that the key to his family's ruin, the seeker who had braved his mountain and catalogued his ancestors' sins, was locked in a small room barely meters away. Elara waited, breathing shallowly, until she heard the senator's tailored shoes click back across the linoleum and the chime of the door as he departed. The threat had materialized, brushed against her, and passed. She left the bathroom, her legs wobbly but her purpose reaffirmed. She grabbed her pack and moved out of the library, not running, but walking with a sharp, controlled pace. She knew the area would be swarming within the hour. She found the nearest bus stop, crowded with commuters and students, and melted into the anonymity of the crowd. She boarded a bus headed back to the city, the vibrations of the engine beneath her seat feeling like a promise of safe passage, the cheap digital camera resting heavily in her pocket, the physical proof of her redemption. Days blurred into an anxious, exhausting watch. Elara was back in her cramped apartment above the perpetual thrum of the laundromat, the space now feeling both safe and incredibly small. The dark sedan was gone from the street, replaced by the casual, anonymous traffic of the city. She waited, every ring of the phone sending a cold jolt through her, the digital camera and the silver key tucked away in a safe deposit box paid for with the last of her coffee-slinging wages. The call finally came, not from the authorities, but from Professor Alistair Finch. His voice, familiar and steady, was filled with a stunned reverence. He had spent 48 hours with the digital photographs, cross-referencing names, dates, and bank records. He had validated the ledgers. "Elara," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "this is it. This is the truth. It's an institutional crime, documented with almost sociopathic precision. The sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence is enough to bury them." The relief was physical, a sudden blinding wave that nearly dropped her to her knees. The burden was gone. She was no longer running, no longer alone. The professor, a man of profound moral integrity, had already contacted the state attorney general's office and, more critically, a high-profile, nationally recognized investigative journalist known for exposing complex historical corruption. The next morning, the silence of the established order was shattered. The story broke, not as a local curiosity, but as a national scandal. Headlines screamed the truth. The Thornland fraud, a decades-old injustice, a true secret history of systematic theft, finally brought to light. The consequences were immediate and absolute. Senator Thomas Thorne's multi-million-dollar development project on Blackwood Mountain was immediately halted, frozen by court order. The sheer volume of the documented crime, the names of the hundreds of ruined families listed in the ledgers, made his position untenable. His political career, built on the stolen foundation of the Golden Touch, was over in a breath of print. The victory was not just political, it was restorative. Legal proceedings began to re-examine land rights and title deeds for the dozens of families who had been swindled a century before. Justice was served, not with a bang, but with the quiet, authoritative precision of historical record. The thematic resolution was complete. The innocent were vindicated, and the powerful, finally, were held accountable. Elara's own financial reward was not instant wealth. There was no vast hidden stash of gold. But there was something far more valuable, a profound, unexpected sense of purpose. A week later, the investigative journalist who had broken the story called her. He had been stunned by the meticulous organization and the flawless, focused research that had led to the discovery. He recognized the latent skill that Elara herself had abandoned. The photographic memory, the tireless drive to expose the underlying architecture of history. He didn't offer her a quick consulting fee. He offered her a full-time position as his lead researcher on historical crimes and cold cases. Her former dream of a scholarly career, once crushed by debt and failure, had returned in a wholly unexpected form. Her talent was finally recognized and monetized. She no longer had to rush to her next low-wage shift, no longer had to hunt dusty basements to flip old furniture. Her path was clear, forged by the moral courage to chase a ghost and the $20 she had gambled on a heavy, ugly box. Elara walked into her daughter's room. Her child was sleeping peacefully, a small, trusting presence. Looking at her, the anxiety that had been a constant companion for years finally lifted. She had earned this second chance, this redemption. Closing narration. Elara Vance had found her true worth not in the forgotten possessions of others, but in the buried, documented secrets of history. The dust of the past had led her to her future. The truth had delivered not gold, but a calling. Now the next cold case, the next quiet injustice waiting to be unearthed, awaits the seeker.